PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
This week on PA Books, Mike Madaio, author of A History of Philadelphia Sandwiches.
Mike Madaio is the author of A History of Philadelphia Sandwiches. Mike, why are sandwiches so entwined into Philadelphia culture?
Well, that was what really drew me to the book, right, was the idea of trying to understand that very question. And it's relatively complicated when it comes down to it, but there was a number of different factors, immigration and the different cultures that came in, and the history of bakeries and the history of street food in the city, and it all sort of came together. Obviously oversimplifying it there, but in the book we go into a lot of detail on trying to figure out why sandwiches became so synonymous with Philly.
Now the sandwich it's such a common food, it's probably something that we take for granted and don't think a lot about, but most things have an origin somewhere, and especially in the United States where you have a lot of immigrant cultures bringing foods in from other places. But how important is that immigrant element to the kind of street food that started to develop in the 20th century?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I think in Philly, in particular with the sandwiches, there's a lot of Italian influence. The cheesesteak was created by an Italian. The hoagie was originally known as an Italian sandwich and had Italian meats and cheeses on it. The roast pork comes from porchetta, which is a central Italian delicacy. And so you saw a lot of that. But I think that the city itself has obviously had other cultures influence it. And I think the German culture that came before the Italians probably influenced the bakery culture, which led to, the bread being such an important piece. And then, since then you've had lots of other different cultures come in and put their own spin on the sandwiches. Banh mi, for example, a Vietnamese sandwich uses the Philly bread in Philly. It's not unique to Philly, obviously, but there's a little bit of a Philly spin on it. And that's an interesting aspect of it as well.
Now you mentioned the importance of Italian immigrants, and that's a big part of the story for multiple sandwiches that you have in here in your book. Now Italian immigrants went to a lot of other cities too, so do you see similar food movements in those cities, or is there something really distinctive about Philadelphia?
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to figure out, because if you look at New York or New Orleans or Chicago, places where there are other strong Italian enclaves, they have some sandwich culture there, but it's not as deep as it is in Philadelphia, and it's unclear exactly why that's the case. New York pizza is sort of more well known, whereas in Philadelphia, pizza was kind of an afterthought, and a lot of the Italian energy, street food energy, went towards sandwiches. And I do sort of wonder if the German bakery influence that was there before maybe started out actually as British and then German baking, and maybe that's something that kind of led to more sandwiches. There could be other reasons, but that's just a really interesting aspect of this. The other thing is, you mentioned the origins, and I think, we as humans are always looking for, like, was there some spark of genius? Some guy decided one day, Joey Italiano put all these things together on a piece of bread, and all of a sudden, the hoagie was invented or whatever. But when you look at it, if you look at, again, some of these other places, New Orleans, New York, New England, New Jersey, like, the submarine sandwich, the hoagie in Philadelphia, there's other names for it as well. It kind of seemed to evolve in parallel, and I don't know that I would say there was like an origin point. It was just that there was, some Italian food tradition of pairing these different meats and cheeses and vegetables and breads together, and someone, put them all together, and it, kind of dovetailed with industrialization and people needing to have like a quick, hearty lunch. And, happening all in all these places at the same time.
So when you're in Philadelphia and you're hankering for something hearty to eat, what's your go-to sandwich?
I'm a roast pork guy, so the roast pork Italian, which roast pork, bitter greens like broccoli, rabe, or spinach with a lot of garlic and olive oil, and sharp provolone cheese. That would be my personal favorite sandwich. A little lesser known than the cheesesteak and hoagie, but I think the locals know about it.
So as you were researching this book, was there anything that really surprised you?
A number of things. Cheesesteaks in particular, when I went into it, I thought to myself that Philadelphians are known for their stubbornness, and I sort of thought cheesesteaks are going to be it's steak, onions, and cheese, and that's it. You can't mess with it. You can't screw around with the formula. But as I got into it, I realized that there's a lot of sort of interesting international versions that are starting to crop up. I mean, they've been around for a little while and starting to get more traction. There's an Ethiopian cheesesteak, there's a Filipino cheesesteak, there's a Jamaican jerk cheesesteak, and so there's obviously still people who want the purists who want the straight up original, but there's some really interesting versions. There's even a salmon cheesesteak, which you could probably argue, is that even a cheesesteak anymore when you replace the beef with salmon? But it's made in the same way, and it's become quite popular in certain parts of the city. So,
are neighborhoods important for some of the differences between foods?
For sure. I think that Philadelphia is known as a city of neighborhoods, and that really helped, I think, develop some of these. Obviously, as we said, with the Italian-American influence, a lot of it was neighborhoods in South Philly that were really driving a lot of these originally. But, neighborhoods all have their own go-to places, and people are very loyal to their neighborhoods. And I think that helps, drive some of this interesting cuisine that we have in the city.
Now, the origins, of course, ultimately lead to mythologies of how things happen. So tell the story that Pat Oliveri tells about the origin of the steak sandwich.
Yes. So, and again, it's a little bit different every time you hear it. And it's one of these, history is written by the victors type things where, who knows exactly what's true or not. But essentially, the story is that Pat and his brother Harry were running a hot dog stand at 9th and Wharton down in South Philly. And they were, served hot dogs every day. And one day, Pat didn't feel like eating hot dogs, and he had a little bit of loose change in his pocket. So he told his brother to go and get some beef trimmings over at a nearby butcher shop. And he mix that up with some onions that he had on the flat top that they put on the hot dogs. And he was making himself a sandwich out of this steak and cheese, not cheese. There was no cheese in the original one, steak and onions. And supposedly a cab driver happened along and said, "Hey, what you got there?" And Pat said, "It was a steak sandwich, I guess." And he either, depending on the story, he either gave it to the cab driver, sold it to the cab driver, gave him half. It's a little bit unclear, but the cabbie basically said, "This is what you should be selling," and he started selling those, and the rest is history.
So how did they move from a cart to a restaurant?
Yeah, so the cart was starting to get relatively popular, and it was right next to a bar, and so during the winter months, when there was less, it was colder, obviously, and there was less desire to stand out in the street and sell stuff, they made a deal with the bar owner to sell the steaks inside the bar. Apparently, at some point, it seemed like there were more people coming for the sandwiches than coming to the bar, and so they cut a window on the side of the building and started selling the steaks out the window, and and then it started to grow. And then Pat's actually had a couple other locations in the city in the early days. In particular, up in Strawberry Mansion area, 33rd and Dolphin, I believe, they had a really large kind of the steak emporium, and it also had other kinds of Italian food and things like that.
So now Pat was a bit of a showman. How much of that was part of the sandwich story in Philadelphia?
Yeah, I think it's a lot. And I mean, if you looked at looked at a number of the different stories, the gregariousness of the guy who was selling the sandwiches was a key point in deciding. And there's a quote from a different book about cheesesteaks that I read that the author said that always stuck with me. That said, the cheesesteak did not become famous because of its taste. It became famous because of Pat. And I think when you look at it, the idea of steak and onions together was not like a revolutionary idea at that time. People did that. There are plenty of evidence of things like that, and steak sandwiches existed. But Pat was this guy who really got the marketing side of it. He used to go to the old Earl Theater and bring steaks with him and get celebrities to take their picture with him and with the sandwich, and try to get them to come by the shop. And then it sort of just became this place to see and be seen, and that I think really helped build the legacy of what became, what's the cheesesteak culture today.
And you have a photo in there of Humphrey Bogart with a pistol holding Pat up.
Yeah.
Now, ingredients, of course, probably are very contentious. People have very strong opinions about what belongs on a cheesesteak. Talk about some of those differences.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, as I was saying, there's a bit of a growth for international, but the basic cheesesteak is steak. It's typically thinly sliced. Ribeye is the most common, although there's a few other cuts that are used. Onions and cheese. Now, on the cheese side, there's Cheese Whiz, which is sort of become the famous one, the one that people know most. There's provolone and there's American. There's some famous political examples of politicians, because they always want to show they're one of the people and go to the cheesesteak place. And John Kerry ordered Swiss back in, I think it was 2004 maybe, and the joke was that ended his campaign. And then J.D. Vance had a similar Swiss incident. It was unclear whether he was referencing the Kerry thing or not, but so there's always controversy over that. The interesting thing about Whiz, though, is that Whiz was not the original cheese. So I think people have come to believe that Whiz is the most authentic, and authenticity is a difficult, you can have different perspectives on that. At Pat's today, Whiz is the most ordered. But the original cheese, my research was a little bit unclear. It seemed like it was probably American was the first cheese that was used, and then provolone. But the Whiz didn't even exist when the first cheesesteak was made. So it was added later, actually, because there was a traditionally Jewish neighborhood near where Pat's was, and so they had a lot of customers who kept kosher, and they didn't want to mix cheese and meat on the same grill. And so Harry, Pat's brother Harry, his son Frank, heard of Cheese Whiz and realized that he could potentially add cheese to the sandwiches without having to mix it together on the grill, and kind of unbeknownst to his father and uncle, he started adding it, and that's what kicked off the Cheese Whiz craze.
Now, one of the other places that was prominent for a while was Jim's Steaks. How was that created, and what was unique about their food?
Yeah, so Jim's, I think what's interesting is that Jim's is a South Street institution today. It's this really uniquely designed kind of Art Deco style place. There was a big fire there a few years ago while I was writing the book, but they've since rebuilt and reopened better than ever. But actually they started in West Philly just as a little window out of the side of their house. Millie and Jim was the couple, and they Millie, just to make some extra money, started selling food out of her row house window. This is on like 60-some street in West Philly, and it eventually started to grow and grow and grow, and she started to make sandwiches and steaks. And then Jim quit his job in construction to help out, and eventually they sold the business to some other folks who kind of created the more iconic imagery of Jim Steaks today. But it goes back to the 30s. It was probably the second sort of the places that are known today. The after Pat's, it was the next one to open.
And then one of the other well-known locations, of course, is Gino's. And is Is there a significant rivalry there, or is that something that's just talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the media really created that, and certainly Frank Olivieri Jr., the one who's running Paz today, had a lot to say that, it was really so taking a short step back, cheesesteaks were pretty regional, like until probably the 90s when you started to see food TV and Travel Channel and places like that do more local food stories. And then, of course, the internet came along. But before that, it was relatively regional. Cheesesteak wasn't super well known outside, Pennsylvania and the Philly area. But Geno's came along in the mid-'60s, started to grow. It also had a kind of flamboyant proprietor who, as the upstart, used to say a lot of things like, we're the best and so forth and so on. And, the media started to pick up on that. And these two places are right across the street from each other. So the media started to say, hey, what's Pat's doing? What's Geno's doing? And started to build up this idea of a rivalry. The way Frank said to me is that in the early days, when Joey Vento was alive, he was the guy who started Geno's, and Frank Sr. were running it. It was a little more heated from a rivalry standpoint. Today, they're pretty friendly, and they realize that the rivalry drives a lot of business for both of them, and the idea that you can go down and try both and so forth is something that I think that they like.
Now, there are also some other variations on it. You have the pizza steak.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about the pizza steak is that today you get, it's mostly red sauce, tomato sauce with provolone cheese, and that's how you create a pizza steak. But when I started to dig into it, I realized that the first steak known as a pizza steak was created at this place called Milano's. It was 11th Street in Mifflin, I believe. I'm not 100% sure on that. And they had sliced Roma tomatoes, oregano, and provolone cheese, and so that was the original pizza steak. And there are still some places that serve that one. Sometimes they call it like an old fashioned or a Milano steak, steak Milano, and so forth. And there's some folks that are interested in bringing that back, but that's kind of an interesting, because it's a little bit different, a little less heavy than the one with a lot of sauce on it.
Now you mentioned the Food Channel and Travel Channel and some of the other kind of national television programs that are traveling around the country featuring the different types of local foods. Did that change? Has it made Philadelphia more of a destination?
I think so. I mean, again, the Pat's Geno's rivalry existed kind of before that locally, but it was ready-made for them to just show up and say, hey, you can come to Philly, the famous cheesesteak. These two places are rivals, competing with each other. And I think it was a perfect story for that. And then I think with the internet, just the way we talk about food and consume food has changed so much, whereas people are always trying to have amazing photos and videos of these different foods. And the Philly sandwiches are so unique and interesting that it offers a lot of opportunity for that, and I think helps drive that as well.
Now, terminology is also part of the story here. So you got hoagies, you got submarines, some places it's called a hero. Where do we settle in Philadelphia?
Yeah, so I mean, hoagie is the word, but there's a lot of speculation on where that word came from, and people don't necessarily know for sure. There was a place in World War I, a shipyard that was built during World War I on a place called Hog Island, which is a little bit south of the city, actually where the Philadelphia International Airport is today. It was an island very close to the mainland. They eventually filled it in when they built the airport. And so the most common story you hear is that these sandwiches were originally called hoggies because of Hog Island, because the Italians who went to Hog Island would bring these big sandwiches, and that's how they became known as hoggies. And eventually, the Philly accent, hoggy, hoagie, kind of morphed it to hoagie. And so that's where hoagie came from. I couldn't find any corroborating evidence to say, like, this is really true. This is the case. I mean, a lot of people believe it. There's the oral history of it, and that's very strong, but there's no written evidence. There's nothing to really make a connection between those two. And the fact is that Hoggy was not written down, at least that I could find, until 1940. So a pretty, we're talking World War I, so Hog Island closed down around 1920. So a pretty large gap between Hog Island and the term Hoggy being, popular in Philly. So probably not is the story. But if you still want to believe it, that's fine too. The other thing I was going to say is that there is evidence that submarine was used in Philadelphia before Hoggy came along. And so, a lot of people in Philly will get quite mad at you if you ask for a submarine, but that actually was here first. So,
who was Al De Palma?
Al De Palma was a guy who became known as the king of the Hoggies and then king of the Hoagies. And he claimed to have invented the term. So by his reckoning, he was working as a jazz musician, and sometime in the 1920s, he was outside the Academy of Music, and he saw some guys eating these big sandwiches, and he said, "Man, you'd have to be a hog to eat one of those." And it stuck with him, and later during the Depression, he was looking for work, and he decided to open up a food shop and started selling sandwiches. And he remembered the hog comment that he has made. At least this is what he says. He's no longer with us, but what he said. And so he started calling them Hoggies. And I think it's pretty clear that he's the one who popularized the term. Whether he truly invented it or not is difficult to prove one way or the other, but he definitely popularized the term. King of the Hoggies, he had shops all around the city, even out in like Westchester and other places for a while. And that's I think his success really drove the adoption of that particular term for the sandwich here.
Now, was there a classic version of the hoagie?
Yeah, I mean originally it was the Italian sandwich, so it was what we would call an Italian hoagie today. I mean, if you go into a shop and just ask for a hoagie, they're going to ask you what kind, right? Do you want turkey? Do you want Italian? Do you want tuna? Do you want, any number of different things? But originally it was an Italian sandwich, so, it does vary by place, which meats, which cheeses, which vegetables potentially, but some sort of combination of Italian ham, salami, capicola, things like that. Usually a provolone cheese, and actually lettuce was a little bit later to the game. Originally it was tomatoes, onions, maybe some roasted peppers.
What were some of the other kind of classic hoagie shops in the mid-20th century?
Well, one of the interesting things is that when you look at some of the places that are popular today, and you look back to how they kind of became popular and became these popular shops. And I'm thinking of in South Philly, you have a place like Ricci's or Cosme's or Campo's. These are all places that have been around for a long time, and they started out actually as corner grocers or butcher shops or places like that. And over time, as the world changed around them and people were shopping more at supermarkets and things of that nature, they adapted and started selling more and more sandwiches, and now they're kind of known as really the top sandwich shops. But that's just a really interesting sort of example of how, as the city evolved and as our lifestyles evolved, early 1900s, you didn't have home refrigeration. You were going to the corner grocer, getting fresh food every day. As you got a refrigerator and started shopping at Acme, you didn't need to do that anymore. And so these places started selling sandwiches at lunch and things like that.
So one of the big challenges out there is whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich. And you have your book on sandwiches has a chapter on hot dogs. So
it does.
Are hot dogs sandwiches? I
say that they are. And my main evidence for this is that historically, and this is a history book, so I'm going to come at it from the historical angle. Before the term hot dog was created, and I do believe the first usage of the term came from Paterson, New Jersey in, I'm blanking on the year, but in the early 1900s. But before that, they were called Frankfurter sandwiches. And so, you know, I mean, obviously Frankfurters could be served with or without bread. And so when they were served on bread, they were called Frankfurter sandwiches. And then eventually someone started calling them hot dogs. And that term caught on. But, you know, that's a strong argument for me.
How much was Philly a hot dog town before it was a cheesesteak town?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's not something that you would associate it today like you would in New York or Chicago, but it was really important. And, you know, when I started writing this book, I didn't expect hot dogs to be their own chapter. I expected it to be more of a footnote. I had heard of something called the combo, which is a fish cake mixed with a hot dog on the same bun, which sounds strange, but actually is a pretty interesting sandwich. But as I started to dig into it, I realized that the place that popularized this combo, called Old Original Levis, had an incredible hold on the city. It was really iconic for a lot of people growing up. It was a place that they went, and it was, I think, certainly pre-cheesesteak, but you know, even after that was an important street food, sandwich food, whatever you want to call it, shop in the Philadelphia culture. I think that in the 1940s, there were some changes to regulations on what carts could, you know, what food carts could do for hygiene and safety issues. And it does seem that the hoagie was kind of, and the cheesesteak were both kind of, they were both introduced in the 30s. And so they were both kind of growing during that time. And this regulation kind of set the hot dog man back, and you started to see more focus on the Italian sandwiches. But certainly before that, yeah, hot dogs were quite important to the city.
You mentioned the combo, the hot dog with a fish cake. How was the fish cake made?
It's white fish that's been cooked, usually cod, with mashed potato. There was a joke that it really should have been called a potato cake with a little bit of fish. This is mostly potato, especially during the leaner times. But that actually makes it's relatively mild, you know. And then it's fried, either pan fried or deep fried, probably depending on the place. And so it's just kind of a patty. And they were not only served with hot dogs. I mean, the fish houses of Philly, bookbinders, places like that, all served fish cakes. It was a popular, you know, dish at the time in both home cuisine, hot cuisine, and everything in between. But somebody had the idea to put it on with a beef frank on a hot dog bun, and it sounds strange, but it's not super strongly flavored, especially next to a beef frank. So, you know, it's almost more textural than that. And then there was also a place called Lenny's, which was kind of the other big hot dog chain in the Levis Lenny's era, introduced something called pepper hash. Again, the fish houses also used this. It was a condiment for fish, but Lenny's introduced it for hot dogs, and it's basically a cabbage salad, like a raw cabbage salad with a lot of vinegar, and that mixed with the beef and the fish, it all comes together quite nicely.
How did Greek immigrants impact hot dogs?
Yeah, so that was back in the days of the hot dog, you know, being the sandwich. There was Levis and Lenny's, which were both Jewish hot dog places, and then you had the Greek places, and they made this chili sauce, which was called Greek sauce in the city, and it basically was a chili style sauce. They called these Texas wieners again because the chili aspect of it, although really it was salsa kitma, I think, which is a Greek sauce, kind of like a Greek bolognese, if you would, kind of based on that, but they put those on. And so if you went and got a Texas wiener, that was the Greek hot dog, and that was something that was also quite popular, although not necessarily unique to Philly specifically. Paterson, New Jersey, which I mentioned before, strange, they as a quick aside, named the hot dog, named the submarine, and claims to have created the Texas Wiener. So an interesting little town in New Jersey that has a lot of emphasis. And then a place in Altoona actually claims to be the originator of the Texas Wiener as well. So, regional, yes, but maybe not Philadelphia specific for the Texas Wiener.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, you have a photo in your book of a sandwich that your grandmother made.
I do.
And Vastetta, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes,
yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah, so Vastetta is actually a roll in Sicily, and they put spleen, fried spleen, typical everyday meat, right? And ricotta cheese and caciocavallo cheese are the traditional way that it's made in Palermo. But when they came to the United States, they didn't have access to spleen regularly, and they also didn't necessarily have access to all the cheeses. So my grandmother and her family mixed it up. They used bacon. Always a good addition, right? So we have it with bacon, ricotta. We usually use provolone. Sometimes you can find the caciocavallo, but it's a little more difficult to source. So that's a Christmas morning delicacy that we have in my family. I think it was eaten after midnight mass, originally, but we just have it in the morning. So that's a family sandwich that certainly spawned my love of sandwiches.
Earlier you mentioned the roast pork sandwich. Tell us about the first time you went to John's Roast Pork.
Yeah, so John's, it's interesting. It's transformed quite a bit in the last few decades. But back when I first went there, the hours were very slim. They were open. I don't remember the exact hours, but I remember they closed relatively early, and it was relatively difficult to get there. I lived down in the suburbs, and obviously if you were down there at lunchtime, it was a popular spot. But we figured out a way one day I read about it and heard about it, and it seemed up my alley. So we went down there, and it's just such a great sandwich. It's interesting because the cheesesteak obviously is very well known and people love it, and it's a good sandwich. But the pork, it's this multi-day process. They roast the pork and they make this gravy, and it's so complex with so much flavor. And then if you add the greens and the cheese, it's just a lovely combination of different ingredients.
Now, is that something that's distinctive to Philadelphia?
Yeah, I think that it's loosely based on the porchetta of Italy, which is a whole roast pig usually. Although, I've had porchetta sandwiches in Italy, and it's usually just the pork on the bread. So I think where the Philadelphia difference is adding the greens and the broccoli rabe or the spinach and the sharp provolone. And you don't necessarily see that quite as often. Obviously lots of places are going to have pork sandwiches, sometimes prepared in slightly different ways. This is an Italian preparation with lots of garlic and Mediterranean herbs and those sorts of things. That gives it a unique flavor as well.
Another sandwich that you talk about is the chicken cutlet.
Yes. So chicken cutlet is interesting because it's seen a little bit of a renaissance. I was in a sandwich shop earlier this week, and we were waiting for our sandwiches, and this guy goes in the back, and he comes back, and walks up. He's just got like 10 chicken cutlets just walking through, and I just thought, yeah, this chicken cutlet's back, But it was something that gained popularity in probably the 50s or 60s. A place called Shanks and Evelyn's, which was a little diner in South Philly that was, very small kind of neighborhood spot, but people who knew it knew that it was great, and they started selling these cutlet sandwiches. They also added the broccoli rabe to the cutlet with the sharp provolone, and that's where that came from. What's interesting about the cutlet, though, is you have that the traditional Italian way that you can prepare it, but What's interesting is to see there's all these, chicken is a relatively bland ingredient. There's not a whole lot to it. So you can add sauces and cheeses and all sorts of different things to it. And there's a lot of interesting takes using chicken. Whereas, with cheesesteak or pork, the meat itself has a ton of flavor, so you don't necessarily want to overpower that. But with the chicken, you can really get creative, and a lot of places are doing lots of interesting things with it.
How did you decide what to include in the book? I mean, obviously cheesesteaks and hoagies you have to include, but how did you make that decision?
Sure. Although it's interesting you say that, because when I first had the idea for the book, I thought about calling it like Beyond the Cheesesteak and just focusing on other sandwiches, since people know so much about the cheesesteak already. And as I got into it, I realized you got to tell the cheesesteak story. It's such an important part of the history that it didn't feel right to not include it, but I did consider that. But yeah, I mean, I think that, as I said, with the hot dog, for example, I didn't expect it to be like, I figured that would, there is a chapter in the book that's other notable sandwiches that is like shorter sections on, a bunch of other sandwiches that are interesting and worthwhile of noting. And I assumed the hot dog would be that, but as I dug into it and I realized, how much of a connection people had to Levis and Lenny's, I started to realize, this deserves its own chapter. And so, I think it was a little bit of just, understanding the differences and focusing on things that are unique. I mean, like meatball parm, for example, is a great sandwich, but it's, I think, less unique to Philly. You go to New York, you can get a really good meatball parm, right? Whereas, cheesesteaks is changing a bit, and you can get a decent one more often outside of the city. But ones that I wanted to focus on, ones that were unique to this area.
Is that also true of something like the Reuben, which is one of my favorite sandwiches? You do find that in other places as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so I talk a bit about the corned beef special, which is, and it's possible that this is made in other places, but it's really only called a corned beef special in this region. And it's cold corned beef with coleslaw and Russian dressing, and so that is a unique sandwich in sort of the Jewish deli tradition to hear. But the Reuben, yes, you can get a Reuben obviously in the city, but it's not necessarily unique to the area.
Are there rules to ordering sandwiches in Philadelphia? If you order an ingredient or something on it, you get looked at askance?
Yes, for sure. It's funny because Pat's, I'm not sure if Gino says this too, but Pat's has a sign that like tells you the rules. Like, this is, how you order, and you go up and you gotta, say your cheese and with or without onions, basically. So whiz wit is the classic cheesesteak with whiz and onions. Not that I would ever order whiz wit. Provolone wit, I think, would be better. And so, it at the end of the sign on the passing, it says, if you mess up, it's okay, just go to the back of the line and try again. But, as I said, I think, things are changing somewhat as we start to embrace lots of different influences and so forth.
Are there some ingredients that are frowned upon? How do people view mayonnaise on some of these sandwiches? Yeah,
so mayonnaise is an interesting one. So on an Italian hoagie, no mayonnaise. That's the classic. But some people like it with mayonnaise, and who am I to tell them that they can't have it with mayonnaise? There are definitely some people in Philly who will tell you that you can't have them with mayonnaise. And then I think the other thing is on cheesesteaks you have, and some people put mayonnaise on cheesesteaks too. And I actually read this after the book came out, but I read that mustard is a growing ingredient on cheesesteaks, which is kind of interesting. But I think the one interesting thing about cheesesteaks is the peppers and the mushrooms. So you can order a pepper steak, you can order a mushroom steak, meaning give me a cheesesteak with peppers on it if you order a pepper steak. But I think the interesting thing is when you go outside of Philadelphia, you see a lot of places making, Philly cheesesteaks, and they put peppers on them. They might put mushrooms on them by default, and that is a no-no. That is not, a standard Philly cheesesteak does not have peppers and mushrooms. Again, you want to put them on, by all means ask for them, but.
So as a food writer and a wine writer, you're used to tasting things. How do you approach writing a book like this when you're so used to doing that?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Somebody said to me, I walked in, I was doing a signing at a bookstore, and I walked in and said, "Hey, I'm Mike, I'm here." And they said, "I expected you to be much wider." And I said, "Yeah, well, you got to just have a couple bites and share it with your family and so forth." It definitely, it can be a lot because these sandwiches are pretty heavy. The other really interesting thing with this book is that so much of it was buried in like oral history. I mean, we talked about the origin of the word hoagie, and other research I've done, there can be a lot of written things, and when you can find things written down, you feel like more confident. Okay, somebody wrote this down. I feel pretty confident that this is the fact. But when the owner of Paz is telling you the origin story, or Al de Palma saying he invented the word hoagie, but there's no necessarily corroborating evidence, it can be challenging to figure out what's a fact and what is just legend. And so you sort of have to just present it that way. Like, okay, here's what we know to be true, and here's what this guy said, and let it stand for itself.
Now, a sandwich, of course, includes bread. Yeah, that's a key component as well. Are there certain types of breads that are essential for each of these different sandwiches?
Yeah, I mean, most of the sandwiches we're talking about, the hoagies, the cheesesteaks, and so forth, have relatively similar bread. In more recent years, the idea of seeded bread has become much more popular, and you're starting to see places make their own bread quite a bit now. These specialty shops are, whereas it used to be buying from Amoroso's or some of the other big bakeries, places like Angelo's these days are making a name for themselves by making their own bread. But the bread is so important to the overall quality of the sandwich. It's such a large part of it. And, when you talk to people who lived in the Philadelphia area and then moved maybe to California, maybe to Florida or somewhere else in the country, they'll say, yeah, the sandwiches are okay here, but the bread's just not the same. And so there's really, that's really such a strong part of what makes these sandwiches so special.
So what makes the Philadelphia bread so different?
Yeah, and so again, we talk about, oral history and what people believe and so forth, and there's a lot of talk about the water. And this is similar to, in New York, they say the bagels and the pizza is different because of the water. And it's somewhat true, but also somewhat false. So water is, 40% of the bread, right? I mean, if you look at the ingredients by volume, the water is going to make a difference. And there's this idea of hard water, which is water that has a lot of minerals, or soft water that doesn't have much. And in New York and Philly, the water tends to sort of be in the middle. And I sort of called it the Goldilocks zone. Like, it has enough minerals to make it interesting, but not enough to make it so difficult to work with, and so forth, with fermentation and gluten development and all those things. I go into this in a bit of detail in the book. But I think there's also just this idea that the tradition is passed down, and the idea that these families learn to make it. I talk about a place called Sarcone's, which is a South Philly bakery, and they're using ovens that are 100 years old, and they're run by family, and these are not ovens that you can just go to the restaurant supply store and replace, and it takes months to kind of learn how to use them and all this sort of thing. So, and then the fact that people value that is so important as well, right? So a place like that can't survive if the customers don't, say, yeah, this is important to us. We're gonna go out of our way to get this bread because it's worthwhile. And so there's a lot of different factors as to what makes the bread so special, but I think that's what makes it interesting too.
Now, people might be surprised to find out that the stromboli it makes an appearance in here. Why is that a sandwich?
Yeah, so it is another debate of whether the stromboli is a sandwich or not, but the stromboli was invented outside of Philly in a place called Essington, which is just outside the city in Delaware County. And it was originally called the prefabricated sandwich. The guy, Nat Romano, who invented it, he was, an Italian immigrant. He kind of took inspiration from the hoagie as well as stuffed breads that he had seen in Italy and made kind of an encased bread that had Italian meats and cheeses in it. And it was dubbed by a customer Stromboli. There was a movie called Stromboli at the time that was very popular, that he got the name from. Stromboli's an island off of Sicily, a small island off of Sicily. And the difference, though, with Romano's Stromboli is that it's a bread dough. So, it requires a fair amount of time and effort to put it together. Other places, pizzerias in particular, once the Stromboli started getting popular, they started using pizza dough, which is a different method, and it's a different consistency. And so if you go into a Stromboli anywhere in America, or if you go into a pizza place anywhere in America and order Stromboli, you're probably going to get pizza dough. But the thing that separates Romano's is that it's this bread dough. And that makes me feel more confident about saying it's a sandwich because it's made with bread dough. Is it sandwich adjacent? Maybe. But it's still an interesting story and a delicious dish, let's call it.
Now, over the past maybe a couple of decades, we're starting to see different types of breads come in, wraps, flatbread, and some other different types of Italian breads that have come over to be used in sandwiches. Are you starting to see those filter their way into the Philadelphia sandwich scene?
Yeah, everything's constantly evolving. And then there's we've been talking about, is it a sandwich or not? And you can debate whether a wrap is a sandwich or not. In some ways, the wrap might be the original sandwich, because I think if you look in the Middle East, that's kind of one of the earliest examples that we have on record of people wrapping fillings in bread. Again, we can leave that debate for another day or for the internet. But yeah, I think, and some people have also asked me, is more health conscious eating, infringing on this? And I think probably, there are places where I think Primo Hoagies is a big chain in the Philly area, and they've gone beyond, and I think you can get any of their sandwiches on a wrap, for example. I've never done that, so I don't know if it's any good or not. But if you're watching your carbs. But I've also seen, lots of vegetarian sandwiches starting to crop up more. They've been around for a while. There's certainly evidence of that, and in the Catholic tradition during Lent, they often had vegetarian sandwiches, but more creative versions of those. I mentioned the banh mi, more vegetables on that, and so there's lots of different ways that the world of the sandwich culture evolves.
As you've surveyed this history of the sandwich, are there certain types of sandwiches or certain ingredients that have fallen out of favor?
Certainly the combo that we talked about is one. There are a couple places you can still get it, but it's definitely not as widespread as it was. I'm trying to think if there are any others that have kind of fallen out of favor. Roast beef is an interesting one in the sense that, again, not necessarily unique to Philly, but it seems like it used to be a bigger part of the sandwich scene. I'm just looking at the cover of the book, and DeNick's says roast pork and beef. And DeNick's is a famous place in the Reading Terminal Market, known for their roast pork. But when I was looking at some of their photos of older signs, it said roast beef and pork. And Joe, who's the owner, said, I'm not sure that there was that much thought to that. But, it's interesting that that maybe beef used to play a bigger role. Now it's like if you want beef, you get a cheesesteak. But the roast beef is an interesting one. There's a place called Nick's Roast Beef that I think in its heyday was bigger than it was. Still around, and there's a couple different locations. But yeah, it's not something that people necessarily associate with Philly these days.
Now, we talked earlier about some of the newer immigrant groups and how they're impacting sandwiches. So let's talk more about that. Like the banh mi, what is that, and what do people expect of that in Philadelphia? Yeah,
so it's a sandwich that came out of Saigon, and it was sort of the French influence. When the French were, trying to essentially colonize Vietnam, and they they eventually left, but there was leftover culinary influence there. And so banh mi is not specific to Philly, but when the Vietnamese community started to grow in South Philly after the Vietnam War and into the 80s, they started using sarcones bread, which was, the Italian bread. So a traditional banh mi is with a baguette, but they started using the Italian bread, and I think that gave it a little bit of a Philly spin on things.
Now, this may sound like an obvious question, but why are sandwiches popular?
Yeah, so I think it's a complicated answer, but they're a fast way to get a lot of food quickly, and I think that I didn't write a ton about the history of sandwiches beyond Philadelphia in the book, but I did a fair amount of research and tried to understand like where they came from, why they're popular, that sort of thing. And you go back, they're named for the Earl of Sandwich. He was a guy in the 1700s who asked for his meals to be brought to him between slices of bread so he could continue doing what he was doing. There are various theories on what it was. He did not invent the idea of a sandwich, but I think what he may have invented was the idea of having it prepared and served to him in sandwich form. So before that, it might have been more common to have bread and meats and cheeses on a plate, and maybe you would assemble it yourself and do a sandwich or something. And then I think when you had industrialization come to the US and probably the UK as well, there were these heavy labor jobs that required a fair amount of calories to, get through the day. And so, but they weren't, and I especially think of Italy, right? So if you're, a lot of the Italians who came to the United States were farmers, so they would have probably taken a relatively long break in the middle of the day to have a leisurely lunch and so forth and so on. But when they came to the United States, they're working in factories, they're working industrial jobs, and they would only have a half hour for lunch, maybe not even that. And so they needed something that they could eat quickly, but that was enough to kind of keep them fueled throughout the day. And that's what sort of drove the invention of the American sandwich, this overstuffed kind of loaf of bread with a lot of stuff in it.
Now, the history of the sandwiches that you're talking about, early on, there were sandwich carts that you would often see on the street. People then move into restaurants, but now we're starting to see, over the past couple of decades, food trucks come out. Have you seen the food truck culture impacting things like sandwiches in Philadelphia?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Certainly there are a number of interesting, sandwiches coming out of food trucks, whether it be cheesesteaks. There's obviously a lot of places making cheesesteaks and hoagies and things like that. I think there's a number of interesting Middle Eastern type places, falafels and things like that are really interesting, going back to maybe the origins of sandwiches. So I think it's just another way that sandwiches are being created, and there's the opportunity for people to be creative and so forth with what they're serving.
What types of trends are you seeing that you think maybe a different approach going into the future?
Yeah, so obviously I mentioned the international influence of things, which is really interesting. The other thing, we talked about this a little bit with the bread, is this idea of making everything. So a hoagie used to be, you would get your dietz and watts or your boar's head meats and cheeses, and you would get the bread from, the bakery, and you would just be assembling it all together. But there are places now where, really chef-driven concepts where they're making every single piece, and whether it's the cured meats and cheeses or other different types of fillings and the breads and, soup to nuts, they're making it all. And, that allows for, again, some really interesting creations from different chefs from different walks of life.
Is there a sandwich that's maybe popular in another city or another location that you wish was prominent in Philadelphia?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The first thing that comes to mind is Chicago's Italian beef, which I think it's almost like a combination of the cheesesteak and the roast pork, because it's slow cooked beef that's braised and kind of pulled and falls apart, so, which is more like the pork that you get in Philly, whereas the cheesesteak is a thinly sliced raw beef that's cooked very quickly. And what I was saying about the roast pork, how because it's slow cooked and the gravy is built up and everything, it's so complex. I think the Italian beef has some of that as well. So maybe blasphemous to say, but it is a delicious sandwich.
Now, different types of barbecue sandwiches are popular around the country. Are there places in Philadelphia where you can get a good brisket sandwich or pulled pork with good barbecue sauce?
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of barbecue places in Philly. I mean, purists might say that, they're not as good as what you're going to get in the Carolinas or Texas or whichever type of barbecue you're trying to get. Although there is a place in South Philly called Mike's Barbecue that does a brisket cheesesteak. So they do the brisket, and they make their own whiz, and it's an interesting merger of the two. This is another example of kind of a more creative take on the cheesesteak.
We've been talking about the book, A History of Philadelphia Sandwiches, with Mike Madaio. Thank you for joining us.
No, thanks for having me. It's been great.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.